Thank you so much, Laura. So before I begin, I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm grateful to have been able to pursue my creative research of the last 2 years in kinship with natural wonders on the unceded territory of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations in Vancouver, on Treaty 1 territory, land of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and homeland of the Métis Nation in Winnipeg, and on traditional unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation in Ottawa. Inspiderations is the MFA thesis project that I've been working on through Emily Carr's low residency program. Over the last 2 years, I've embarked on a creative research project that resulted in a written and material component. With the final semester being remote, I'm grateful to Gallery 101 to have given me the opportunity to present this thesis show to the public in Ottawa, where I now live. A big thank you to Laura, Christina, and Hector for making this happen, and to Firegrove Studio for image and video documentation. I also want to thank my family, my friends, my cohort, my instructors, and my thesis supervisor for supporting and inspiring me over the last 2 years. And all of you who have gone over and above, and you know who you are, collecting dried spiders in your basements and attics for my work. Avant de continuer aussi, j'aimerais ça mentionner que je vais faire la présentation en anglais, comme ma thèse a été rédigée en anglais, mais ça va me faire plaisir de répondre aux questions ou de discuter en français après la présentation. If you want to add questions to the chat as well as I'm talking, please go ahead and we'll have a discussion period at the end of the discussion, of the presentation. So to start with, I'd like to start with a quick video walkthrough of the space by Firegrove Studio, and then we'll get into my presentation. So I'll just start sharing this. So just bear with me, I have to. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to the presentation. Okay. In February 2021, a group of conservation biologists released a warning to humanity about insect extinction. This warning spoke of the consequences of insect extinctions and how this would negatively impact humanity. Human activity is responsible for almost all current insect population declines and extinctions. The result of this interference, purposeful or inadvertent, is a loss of over 75% of biomass of the world's insects. My work focuses on the loss of biodiversity and the reduction in insect populations due to climate change and human interference in their life cycles. I consider how artists can communicate a sense of empathy, compassion, and kinship with insects and arachnids that encourages thoughtful cohabitation and the adoption of sustainable ecological practices. Through my work, I evoke the decline in species primarily through imprint techniques, using found insects and non-toxic materials. I only gather and work with insects that have previously perished and insect materials purchased from ethical sources. Reflections on killability of non-humans and the looming ecological crisis caused by the loss of species are a key part of my practice and of my approach in memorializing dead insects in a subtle, poetic way. My passion for printmaking and my work with found insects lead to reflections on environmental decline as the resulting imprints memorialize insects and evoke presence through absence. From an ecological perspective, we are now in a precarious situation that requires both the conservation and restoration of forests and grasslands and freshwater areas crucial to avoiding the disappearance of insects, while also having to acknowledge and care for the nature that exists and the new emerging ecologies that have evolved in colonized landscapes, where only partial recuperation may be possible. With a majority of people living in urban and peri-urban areas, it is more important than ever to get along with non-humans in the world that we've created. This includes being mindful of feral ecologies and of the life that has established itself in garbage hills, human-built structures, and urban areas. I began my artistic journey with insects by focusing on bees. Domesticated bees with their distinctive stripes, social behavior, importance as pollinators, and honey production easily gather favor from humans. While working with bees, I learned about apiculture and became involved with managing hives. This gave me an increased awareness of the impact and consequences of domestication and the ecological ramifications of the introduction of foreign species of bees that are taking over local pollinators' forage. My experience with bees motivated me to begin raising awareness of ecological issues with a broadened focus on many species of insects and other arthropods. As I moved forward to new inquiries, I honed my focus on attempting to evoke empathy for species that are often vilified or unnoticed. Globally, considerable resources are spent to control the presence of unwanted insects in our environment with pesticides, traps, biocontrols. Artificial light, electromagnetic waves, urban infrastructure, pollution, and climate change resulting from human activity are also responsible for plummeting insect numbers. During my first term at Emily Carr, I was challenged to use a medium I hadn't worked with. I chose clay as a new way of memorializing arthropods through imprint and of creating future fossils. I fired clay tiles in which I inset insect bodies, only to discover that the 4 spiders that I had fired had some kind of blue crystals in their abdomen. This discovery set the direction of my creative research. What I perceived as the distillation of a creature to its crystalline essence inspired me to explore interdependence of all things in my work. As I was investigating possible avenues to identify what I'm calling spider crystals, my thesis supervisor put me in touch with the organic chemistry lab at Simon Fraser University. So far, what we know about the blue inclusions is that their composition is drastically different than the clay they have grown on. The analysis of their composition reveals high levels of phosphate and traces of copper. On the scanning electron microscope, they appear as agglomerations of small spheres. Further tests are required to determine whether there is a crystalline structure and whether the color is the result of light diffraction. The inspiration I got from the spider inclusions developed into interconnections, a network of nodes that include spiders and clay, etched insects on copper cells that generate electricity to light up microcosms of an environment out of balance. The idea for this network was inspired by the material discovery and by my readings of Donna Haraway and Jane Bennett. In her book, sorry, there's somebody else. Sorry. Okay. In her book, Staying with the Trouble, theorist Donna Haraway invites us to make kin with non-humans and to embrace symbiosis, making with. Symbiosis in nature refers to collectively producing systems that do not have self-defined spatial or temporal boundaries, and in my work, thinking with and becoming with the small beings that surround us. In Haraway's words, symbiosis is a word for worlding with, in company. Moving away from the term Anthropocene, Haraway named the current era the Cthulhucene, after a Western California spider, Pimoa Cthulhu. Haraway writes, spider is a much better figure for symbiosis than any inadequately leggy vertebrate of whatever pantheon. My iterative cycle of inquiry and the links I established between topics, materials, and research could be seen as an ever-evolving web of symbiosis. As I was investigating crystals, my material research brought me to read Jane Bennett's Vibrant Matter. What Bennett calls thing power manifests itself in the inorganic. Even the humblest forms of matter and energy have the potential for self-organization beyond the relatively simple type involved in the creation of crystals. In my work, what initially began as a reflection on blue crystals formed in the abdomen of spiders fired in clay moved to reflections around copper being the core of the spider's blood molecules, to copper being an essential trace mineral in humans. We are all walking, talking minerals, to copper conducting electricity, and to copper crystals growing from electrolytes in contact with metal. Interconnection evokes links between species in the web of life and around key inorganic and organic component in our environment, being essential, but also detrimental when out of balance. It aims to frame the current ecological crisis, as well as document and memorialize disappearing species. What you see here is an older version of interconnections that led me to another discovery. To truly establish interconnections and to have energy flowing between the various components of the network, the idea of creating a battery surfaced. I realized that the etched copper insect circles paired with aluminum and an electrolyte could become cells that generate electricity. I viewed the concept of this electrical network as a physical manifestation of insects that are indispensable to ecological networks and that over time are disappearing as their lights extinguish, as the electrolyte stops powering the pieces. By creating a small-scale version of an electrical network with interconnections, I also thought of Jane Bennett's reference to the power grid as an example of an assemblage that results in action and responsibility that crosses human, non-human divide. I tried many types of electrolytes. I worked with agar with salt and vinegar and eventually made a sort of tapioca Play-Doh with salt and tartaric acid. The creation of cells with electrolytes also led me to another discovery. The high salt content sparked the growth of crystals with copper inclusions that looked almost like little organic growths that were echoing the blue spider inclusions. This is what resulted in the idea of growing these on what I call microenvironments with cyanobacteria and copper crystals. From spider crystals to electroetching with blue copper sulfate crystals to growing microenvironments, both copper and cyanobacteria became key to my material research. Together, they deploy a harmonious palette of blues and greens. Both are unstable and change color over time. Cyanobacteria, or blue-green algae, is 3.5 billion years old and has been responsible for important changes on the surface of the planet, and was also essential to our evolution as it was responsible for the addition of oxygen in the atmosphere. With climate change, cyanobacteria is a growing threat to many ecosystems. Out of balance, cyanobacteria can be toxic. It can overtake bodies of water and kill them by changing the pH, and with its decomposition, removing the oxygen in the water. Copper, as a micronutrient, is essential to most living things. It is the core of the blood cells of spiders and many other arthropods. It is essential for the human brain to function. Copper has antimicrobial, antibacterial, and antiviral properties. Copper connects us to the various networks. It is used for electrical and data wires, for pipes connecting us to water sources. Burning fossil fuels, particularly coal, release copper pollution. Copper in high concentrations in the environment is toxic. Cyanobacteria require copper micronutrients for photosynthesis, but in large quantities, copper will kill cyanobacteria. Copper is an algicide used to remove cyanobacteria from water bodies and surfaces. Copper and cyanobacteria serve as a metaphor for inorganic and organic component in our environment being essential, but also being toxic and detrimental when out of balance. The use of copper as cyanobacteria as materials, as examples of vibrant matter, allow me to generate microcosms of an environment out of balance and serve as a support and backdrop to reflect on climate change and the disappearance of species. My interest in cyanobacteria as a medium came as I gathered it from the shores of Lake Winnipeg, along with mayfly bodies. Insects with positive phototaxis have evolved to use the moon as a navigational guide. Together, today, these nocturnal insects are distracted by artificial lights that are interfering with their navigational instincts and natural cycles. Reflections on light pollution led me to create a swarm of mayflies, screen printed from mayfly body imprints on silk using cyanobacteria and mayfly bodies that I gathered from Lake Winnipeg. Mayfly nymphs spend a year underwater, where their grazing is important to control the buildup of algae. Adult mayflies die in mass around light sources, never accomplishing their goal and completing their life cycle, negatively impacting the ecosystem. I screen printed a mayfly swarm on silk by using the found bodies of mayflies directly on the screens to create my stencils, and I developed a way of using cyanobacteria as ink. The result were 2 8-foot silk pieces that are hung in front of a light. This simulated a swarm attracted by artificial light. I discovered that by using a UV light, I could attract a live swarm to the piece, and that it would allow me to experiment with cyanotype that is sensitive to UV rays. The image produced by putting paper treated with UV-sensitive cyanotype emulsion behind a moth that has landed on the fabric is the imprint, the trace of a momentary encounter. Depending on the wattage of the UV light, the image of a moth can take from 5 to 30 minutes to expose. The long exposure often captures subtle movements of the insect over time and yields an imprint that is ghostly and poetic. This allows me to capture images of ephemeral moments of insects joining the swarm. The piece, despite distracting moths momentarily from their regular habits, does so in a very minimal way and is meant to be a gentle interference, inspiring responsibility or the ability of response from both the human and the insect. The first outdoor Phototaxis installation during the summer of 2020 was hung from a tree branch in my backyard. As the concept evolved, following crits and discussions with my peers, I started working on a standalone Phototaxis installation that could travel to allow me to set it up in various environments and in public settings for educational opportunities. The standalone Phototaxis installation evolved into a lamppost-like installation to which I added a papier-mâché globe with found cocoon inclusions. I also reworked the fabric pieces and added screen prints from moth bodies that I had collected using homemade verdigris or copper acetate pigment, in addition to the screen printed mayflies using cyanobacteria ink. The copper pigment's slight metallic iridescence evokes powdery scales on the moth wings and complements the cyanobacteria used for the moths. Silk was chosen as a fabric because of the relevance of using the entomological fiber in this context. The final Phototaxis piece uses only piece or ahimsa silk, which is harvested from moths that have emerged from their cocoons alive. The choice of cyanobacteria and copper as ink are a continuation of my reflection on the world out of balance. Several studies demonstrate that of all non-human invertebrates, invertebrates are the lowest on the human empathy scale, as they lack anthropomorphic qualities and often inspire negative perceptions. With this information at the outset of my research, I became motivated to investigate various ways of building and communicating a sense of empathy, compassion, and kinship with insects and arachnids. During this past year and a half of pandemic confinement, my focus inevitably turned to indoor ecology. The documentation of my indoor biome was set in motion by my connection with a spider who died of thirst in the winter of 2020. When I relocated to Ottawa from Winnipeg in the fall of 2019, a small female bronze jumper moved in with us, taking refuge on a kitchen chair. I immediately felt like I was establishing a connection with the spider, and I named her Charlie. Because the weather was freezing outside, I ended up relocating Charlie to a succulent plant by the window in the guest room. I lost track of her until when, about 3 months later, her little dried up carcass fell down from the blinds and bounced on the windowsill. I had failed her. Spiders living in a house can go several weeks without food, but they need water regularly. As a gesture of hospitality, inspired by Charlie's death, I started giving water to all house spiders. In some areas, I spray webs with a mist of water every few days. For other wandering species, I was initially leaving little bottle caps with water, and I eventually decided to create porcelain spider drinking dishes with reliefs of found spiders. The reliefs are created by pressing clay in the imprints of porcelain spider nodes that I created previously. The resulting relief is very detailed and serves as a memorial to so many spiders that were found dried up in basements and attics after going for too many days without water. The edges of the dish have an organic shape and are porous and unglazed, making them easy to climb. The inside of the dishes are shallow and finished with a food-safe glaze that is tinted with copper carbonate, a copper salt that echoes the color of the spider crystals. One of the reliefs was created from Charlie's imprint. As I installed the dishes at Gallery 101 this month, I discovered a family of cellar spiders who appeared to be appreciating them and interacting with them in various ways. Just like the Phototaxis piece, I see this as a gentle interference that encourages responsibility from both the human and the non-human, and that brings visitors of both species face to face, giving us a chance to think with and become with the smaller beings in our environment. This reminds me also of the work of Argentinian artist Tomás Sarcino. In the fall of 2018, Sarcino opened an art exhibition titled On Air in the Palais de Tokyo in Paris. On Air focused on ecological preoccupations articulated around the air that envelops both humans and non-humans. As part of this show, Sarcino went to the Palais de Tokyo 6 months before the show to investigate the inhabitants of the building and found close to 500 spiders in all corners of the building. To prepare for this exhibition, the Palais de Tokyo staff stopped cleaning the building and removing spiders from the space for 6 months before the opening. Over that period, the spiders slowly took over the space. In an interview about the show, the curator said that the idea of giving spiders this attention was to remind us that we live in the same habitat, that we share the same spaces, and that it becomes urgent for humans to understand that the gaze they pose on these species and the way they treat them. Even though this was not purposeful, I'm grateful that to be the first artist to install at the end of the lockdown at Gallery 101, because it gave me a similar opportunity to interact with the locals. My work extended to other species of spiders that settled in my home and studio as I started establishing connections with them, focusing on the nature in my home and becoming a home-based citizen scientist. My documentation resulted in spider narratives, augmented reality books in which I was able to share glimpses of my observations. All three narratives for Brian, Gretchen, and Julia have become books that use a similar storytelling approach. The simple narrative is told from a first-person perspective of someone who is not a scientist and expresses their feelings for the subjects observed. Simple line drawings and background photographs are used to illustrate the books. These illustrations and photos allow a reader to follow and understand the stories without requiring any additional content. An additional layer of augmented reality has been added to the books. Augmented reality brought up with our phones to discover the spiders, to bridge scalar differences, and to discover what we don't normally see or pay attention to, is parallel to how phones allow us to discover the world, to magnify things, to view them in much greater detail, and to get more information about them at our fingertips. This allows us also to notice a very real part of the world that we either don't notice or that we consciously decide to block out. Researcher Adam Dodd refers to the insect world as a mythical space that has come to function as a conscious metaphor of the unconscious mind, a world that is both here and there, with us, surrounding us, beneath or behind our lived conscious reality, influencing our lives in ways of which we are normally only vaguely aware of. He observes that modern domestic spaces, in particular, are largely defined by their selective inclusion of non-human organisms and successful exclusion of insects. And that this can lead to the belief that if we can't see the insects in our environment, they are not there. I also took many photos of jumping spiders in and around my house. Just like with Charlie, I felt an immediate connection to the three species of jumping spiders living around my home. Jumping spiders can be extremely curious and interactive. This is due to their vision that is as sharp as a dog's and their hearing that can detect sounds from over 3 meters away. They're constantly assessing their environment for prey or mates and are curious about all movements and sounds. This behavior can lead to engaging moments of interactions between humans and spiders. The spider's 2 prominent eyes make them easier to anthropomorphize than spiders with 8 eyes of the same size, which immediately look alien. By sharing some of these photos with my cohort during crit sessions and on social media, a lot of people who would not normally connect with spiders responded very positively. This resulted in a series called Empathy Portraits, with a focus on jumping spiders in and around my home. With the expansion of the indoor biome, humans are increasingly disconnected from the natural world as they remain indoors and have less opportunities to interact with non-humans in more natural settings. In response to this disconnection, I worked on the development of Intersect, a web-based augmented reality exploration of geolocated spheres connected to momentary encounters between humans and non-humans, pulled in real time from the iNaturalist database. iNaturalist is an international biodiversity database of images and information on observations compiled by amateurs, citizen scientists, and naturalists. Users around the world are encouraged to contribute to science by logging observations of the species they encounter. In Intersect, I only pull insect observations from the database, and they appear over a camera view of the user's surroundings as spheres floating that differ in size based on geolocation proximity. The spheres become literal biospheres and appear otherworldly, emphasizing the alienness or otherness some perceive from the arthropods. Clicking on a sphere allows users to view a photo and the name of the arthropod, pulled from the database, giving a first layer of contact, of familiarity. The augmented reality framework I am using for Intersect and for the augmented layer in the books is a combination of A-Frame and ARJS. This technology is web-based, free, open source, and does not require users to download an app. The first book I created uses number code recognition, and the last two leverage NFT, or non-fungible tokens, for image recognition to trigger the augmented reality layer. I see the importance of leveraging this technology because it is easily and freely available to artists and their audiences. In January 2020, I presented a workshop for artists interested in using web technology to create augmented reality experiences through Video Pool in Winnipeg, and I would be happy to continue sharing my experience with others moving forward. Through my creative research, I've come to acknowledge that an important part of my goal to evoke empathy for invertebrates has become taking these non-humans from being killable to the point of making them breathable. I'm focusing on sharing my own sense of empathy with insects and arachnids by infusing it as visual poetry in my work in the hope to inspire opportunities for positive encounters, to instill wonder, and to change human perception of arthropods. By celebrating living invertebrates and by memorializing fallen ones, grievability becomes the evidence that their non-human lives have value, that their loss is significant. Communicating the value of arthropod lives and encouraging people to get to the stage of compassion, empathy, and grief is one step. But to have a significant impact on ecological issues, solutions proposed by scientists involve communicating the instrumental value of insects in the language of policymakers and environmentally responsible large corporate landholders. This ties into French philosopher Félix Guattari's tri-ecological vision and the belief that artistic creation can be a means to work towards new modes of subjectivity that can eventually translate into policy changes. In Guattari's final works, Three Ecologies and Chaosmosis, he discusses ecosophy, a concept that can be defined as an activist practice that engages artistic production towards maximizing traits of mental ecologies with a commitment to ethically responsible negotiations of collective actions and large-scale engagements. The key to applying this activist practice in my work is reaching the three ecological spheres defined by Guattari, to reach the psyche subjective sphere, to impart a sense of empathy, compassion, and kinship, to reach the cultural sphere, to encourage thoughtful cohabitation, and eventually impact and reach the environmental sphere through the adoption of sustainable ecological practices on a larger scale. The concept of ecosophy emboldens me to work towards the production of work that aims to encourage new systems of values and a new gentleness to help tackle the ecological crisis at hand. I've heard from several people now about how my creative research has led them to think about their small housemates in a different way, and how it has led them to be more hospitable to them, either leaving them be or moving them without harming them. If my work can lead to better appreciation or respect of indoor or backyard ecologies, this is already a step towards compassion and empathy for animals and insects. And it will hopefully lead to further action in larger spheres to help the impending extinction of species. Okay, well, thank you very much to everyone who has joined. Merci à tout le monde qui se sont joints à nous. It would be my pleasure to answer some questions or to have a discussion. On peut aussi y aller en français, c'est comme vous voulez.
Thank you so much, Valerie. I learned so much from you, and I certainly think that our